Let's start off by talking about what is the golden age of musical theater. So this is a term that has been labeled for quite some time by historians and educators in this industry. And it is still often referred to as this label, and we'll talk about this later on in the video about if we should rename it and relabel it. We'll have that conversation as well. But let's talk about what is the golden age. So the golden age of musical theater was initiated in the 1940s, specifically by Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein II. Now, what they did as a composing lyricist librettist team is create a series of musicals that drastically shifted the stories that were being told on stage. So prior to the 1940s, you have to also consider that in the 1920s, we were talking about fluff and musicals that just made you laugh and lighthearted. And the 20s and 30s, it was still really honestly called musical comedies. It wasn't just a musical, it was a musical comedy. The 30s, we started transitioning a little bit more into dramatic storylines, but once we hit 1940s, Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein said, hey, I want to do something different. I want to tell different stories on stage. So they created the musicals that you might know, you might have heard about. A few of them include Oklahoma, Carousel, South Pacific, The King and I, The Sound of Music. Those are considered their most successful musicals in mainstream theater. And the biggest difference they did here was Richard Rodgers allowed Oscar Hammerstein to craft the lyrics into a fundamental part of the story. So instead of coming out and having a song and dance with a bunch of big chorus girls and beautiful costumes and ensemble just to make you feel good, the stories allowed us to understand what the character was going through, what they were thinking, what they were feeling, and all of the dance and the singing and the storytelling furthered the plot rather than it stopping from song to song. So the musicals that they created and the dramatical choices that they put on stage, it immediately shifted the industry from what it was before and created what most people call now as like the book musical. So how they shifted musical theater, musical comedy, changed the path of how we look at musicals now. And I know a lot of people look at like Rent and Spring Awakening and all of these very contemporary musicals, but we have to start somewhere. And this is the place that these stories shifted and the way that musicals were written shifted and what was being told on stage completely shifted in the 1940s. And we do have a lot of other fabulous musicals that were happening in the 1940s, like Carmen Jones, On the Town, Annie Get Your Gun, Finian's Rainbow, Lady in the Dark, a lot of musicals that were starting to kind of do the same. But Rodgers and Hammerstein really, they're the ones that made this happen. So that's why you see in audition posts quite often, you see sing something from the golden age of musical theater. That's the really, truly the 40s and then into the 50s. And what often happens is these musicals are looked upon as the best musicals of all time. And because we know that theater is subjective, what I want to talk about next is, should we be calling this the golden age of musical theater? Because it wasn't the golden age of musical theater for everyone. Did it drastically change our industry? Yes. But was it golden and amazing for everybody in this industry? So I want to have a conversation about, are these works still relevant? Now, I want to be very clear here. I am not saying that we should not do these works. I am not saying that we should always do them in a different convention. I want you to have this time to start off by thinking about how these musicals affect folks, how they might affect them in a way that is not golden and happy and wonderful and nostalgic. Because most of the time what happens is this conversation that we're having right now turns into, well, these shows are very nostalgic and they should be done exactly like they were done in the 40s. That was like 80 years ago, almost 100 years since these musicals were written. We have grown as a society since then. We have grown as an industry since then. So my question to you, are they relevant? And if we do them, how do we re-examine them from a lens that is going to pay tribute to the playwrights, pay tribute to the composers, pay tribute to the works that they created, but also to recognize that we are in a very different time of society now than we were in the 1940s. And the best thing we can do is to know where we come from, know the history of our industry, just like any other industry as well. Knowing where you come from is very helpful because these cautionary tales that we're talking about of not repeating what we've done in the past are going to help us move forward in an industry that is inclusive and that is representative of all people, of all stories. A great example is minstrel shows. Those happened a very, very long time ago, but they still have been seen in musicals in the recent 50 years. And we are still seeing folks not understand and have trouble understanding why blackface and yellowface is harmful and hurtful to people. And so what I'm really asking you to do is open up a conversation and really listen to somebody else's experience. So how do we rethink these musicals moving forward? We can consider them early dramatic musicals. We can consider them early Broadway. We can consider them early musical comedy, if you will. But this time period of musicals where it did drastically shift, but still understanding that a lot of these stories are no longer culturally relevant to us now. And so if we present these shows moving forward, how do we do that in a safe way, but in a culturally relevant way? Take, for example, Oklahoma, the recent revival. That show, the concept was completely different than it was originally, but it did keep the same storyline and the same issues, the same challenges intact. But it was in a very, very different way that was relevant to a newer generation. And I'm not talking about a generation just in their 20s. I'm talking about a generation that is in the last 50 years. You either really loved it or you either really didn't enjoy it. And there's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, those shows just aren't for me. And I respect where we came from, but these are the things that I'm interested in as an actor. There's nothing wrong with that. Have these conversations and don't be afraid to listen to someone else's opinion that may be different from yourself. I hope this was informational and educational to you and gave you some insight. And I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'll see you in the next video.